Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Today, at the seminar, the monthly seminar that we are having at the Department of Political Science in University of Hyderabad, I have the immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker, uh, Julien Levesque, um, or as I call him, Julien. Dr. Julien Levesque is a political sociologist whose work focuses on issues of identity in South Asian Muslim societies. He is currently the head researcher in the Politics and Society Division of Centre des Sciences Humaines, CSH, in New Delhi. And he is also affiliated with the Center for South Asian Studies, CEIAS, at the EHESS Paris. And he's affiliated there as a postdoc researcher. He holds a PhD, which he completed in 2016 in political science from the EHESS in Paris, which is the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. His doctoral research focused on nationalism and identity construction in Sindh after Pakistan's independence. His ongoing work looks at dynamics of caste and leadership among Muslims in North India and Pakistan. And he has published from his work, and one of his most recent publications is actually a special issue that he co-edited with Laurence Gautier in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, and the special issue is titled Historicizing Sayyadness, Social Status and Muslim Identity in South Asia. Apart from this illustrious bio, I also have the pleasure of introducing him as a former colleague from the CSH, where I am an associate member, and also as a colleague who particularly respects Julian's work because of his embeddedness in the field, and also one particular aspect that really fascinates me about his work is the fact that he has working knowledge of 3 South Asian languages, Hindi, Urdu, as well as Sindhi, and he can read and write as well in those, and which is great. So without further ado, I will hand over now the proceedings to the chair for today's session with Professor K.C. Suri. He needs no introduction to this gathering. But just briefly, Professor K.C. Suri is one of the senior most professors in our department, and his work is mostly located in the area of Indian politics, and he is an expert on study of political parties, as well as study of elections and more broadly democratic processes. So, Professor Suri, over to you.
Thank you, Sneha, for your succinct and introduction of the speaker today, Julien Levesque. I, on my own behalf and on behalf of the department, the head of the department, Professor Kamkhan Swan Housing, and other colleagues, and also the students of the business scholars and students of the department. It is a pleasure having Julien with us today. And the COVID situation has expanded new opportunities. Every crisis has its own, negatives and positives. So in a way, because of this availability of online interactions, we are able to meet, although virtually. And I thank Julien Levesque for agreeing to speak to us on this theme, which I think is an important, a pertinent one, a sensitive one, a controversial one, and a much debated one these days in India. And politically salient theme for not only for academicians but for people at large. So I'm not very much familiar with, Dr. Julien Levesque should pardon me for my unfamiliarity with his work. I will look forward to reading. I tried to access a few of his writings yesterday and the day before after I was told to chair the meeting, but I was not able to access them for some reason. So I will reserve my comments maybe towards the end when the discussion begins. So the format for today is first Dr. Levesque will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion for another 30-40 minutes. So I'm told that would be the format for today's talk. But I will just take a few minutes to share my own kind of warm up. It is not necessary that the speaker would respond to this. But I thought I would just open up this discussion on this theme. Number one, I thought that this is a very old theme, but acquiring a new content every time. Like any other theme, most other themes that we talk about, they don't arise all of a sudden. They have been there quite for some time, historically, maybe for the last several centuries. But they keep acquiring a new dimension at the turn of these particular moments of political and social evolution. So the question that we face today is what kind of the content and the character and the personality that the Muslim politics now have acquired in recent years. Probably, I guess that Levi could be speaking about that, the formation of or acquisition of a new content and character to the politics of politics. I don't know what the term to use, whether it is Muslim politics or politics among Muslims or politics of Muslim identity or politics of Islam, radical Islam. These are different terms that that are in circulation. But to use the word for the time being, Muslim politics, I think that's the first thing that I'm wondering, whether in what way the Muslim identity has changed, because we know from sitting in Hyderabad, most of us, we know that Muslim identity has been there in Hyderabad for centuries, and in the 1940s and 50s, it was actually very virulent in a very negative sense. And then the annexation, whatever you call it, merger of Hyderabad into India. And then there is a party called Majlis Party in Hyderabad, on which some academic work also has been done of late Adnan Faruqi and Rojna Vajpayee. They also have published. But there are others. I remember when I was a student, I read, I don't know how many of you know, there was a professor called Professor Rashuddin Khan from Hyderabad, who was a professor at the Center for Political Studies in JNU, who was the chairman, who was also a member of parliament in Rajya Sabha. And he wrote a beautiful essay on Majlis Party and Muslim politics in Hyderabad. So we read it. I was highly impressed by his writing those days. I think it was never published. It was circulated as a monograph those days. So this has been there. So the question could be, what is the new character of Muslim identity and Muslim politics after the rise of the BJP as a dominant, if you term like that, as a major political force, and especially after it coming to power in late 1990s. That's the first question that comes to my mind. The second question that comes to my mind is, what do we mean by Muslim party? And I'm thinking of parties like here in MIM or in Assam or in Kerala, Muslim League. So what do we mean by a Muslim party? Do we call a Muslim party a party because it secures a majority of votes from Muslims, or its leadership is Muslim, or its members are cadres are Muslim, or its ideology is Muslim, that Muslims must vote only for Muslim leaders. Only Muslim leaders can represent Muslims, and Muslims are a separate community. This kind of an ideology. So, what makes a party a Muslim party or a Christian party, for that matter, like Kerala Congress in Kerala? There are different factions in Kerala, Christian claiming to represent Christians. And what makes a party a Hindu party? So, at what time we term a party as a Hindu party or a Christian party or a Muslim party? I think that's the second question that comes to my mind. The third one is, who are these Muslim? What do we mean by a leader? Is a leader only just a representative of who happens to be a Muslim, or who claims that he represents the Muslims? So, and what level we are thinking of Muslim leader, whether we're talking of Owaisi, or we are thinking of an MLA in Hyderabad, or thinking of a ward councillor, or thinking of a local leader, a gully leader, street leader, who would mobilize votes at the time of elections or party rallies, etc., etc. A third one is, what are the ways in which Muslim parties and Muslim leaders have conducted Muslim politics in the era of extended democratization, if I call like that. So as democracy has expanded and deepened over the years after independence, so how the electoral strategies and political mobilization, techniques of political mobilization, tactics, if one can call it, of political mobilization have evolved, especially after the emergence of a kind of multiple bipolar party systems in different states. We don't have one party system in different states. So how do we, so can we call, when we say a Muslim voter, what do we mean by a Muslim voter? Who are they? I mean, how do we account for so much of variation among Muslims, among the population, the minority, majority statuses of these Muslims, and the kind of parties that are present? So there is a huge variation of the political landscape, and how do we really, what are the difficulties that the researcher would face when he or she would try to kind of generalize about Muslim politics and Muslim voter, etc. These are some of the questions that come to my mind, which are not very systematic, which are not well thought through questions. But I thought I would just put them on the table, as they call in English, and I'm sure with his very focused, systematic research in this area, Dr. Julien Levesque would enlighten us, certainly, and we will be greatly benefited by his talk. And I look forward to listening to his talk now. I request Dr. Julien Levesque to speak on this topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Suri, for these excellent introductory remarks. I think it frames the debate very well. I'm really grateful to the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad for inviting me today. And I'm grateful in particular to Anagha Ingole and for organizing the talk, and to Sneha Banerjee for the kind introduction. I think the four main questions that Professor Suri just raised, as I said, I think it frames the debate very well. I am not certain I'll respond to all of them, but I have to say these are a lot of the questions that I have in mind in my research, whether it's about the content of Muslim politics, as you said. I am indeed interested in what kind of sense, what kind of meaning people infuse into politics, into the political process. What do we mean by Muslim parties? That is also an excellent question. And I think I will mention some of that in today's talk. What do we mean by Muslim leaders and by representation? And what other ways have Muslim parties and leaders and organizations conducted politics? In fact, so this is not going to be the focus of my talk today, but in terms of also locating today's presentation in my broader body of work, for the past few years, one of the things that I have been doing is building a biographical database of Muslim leaders in India. And there is no existing list of Muslim leaders. I mean, nobody does a top 100 Muslim leaders in India. So I couldn't rely on such a list. So with my colleagues, we determined a number of organizations, and we basically took people who occupy leadership positions in these organizations in order to reduce the arbitrariness. But clearly one of the things that we had in mind and that we were aiming for was precisely to try and understand how representation happens beyond the electoral mandate. So in a sense, we relied on the notion of representative claim. Who makes representative claim? Who claims to represent Muslims? And through this notion, I think that helped us define Muslim leadership. Now, today, I'm not going to present a database. And so I will present fieldwork. Sorry, I think, are you seeing? Okay.
Yes, we can see your screen. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So I will present recent fieldwork that I conducted in North India, and particularly in northeastern Bihar in Simachal. And the reason why I conducted fieldwork in Simachal is, of course, because the Majlis Party, so All India Majlis Ittihad al-Muslimin, the AIMIM, recently won 5 seats in the Bihar elections last fall in October. And so I went there in February. I had previously conducted fieldwork during the Bihar elections around the region of Patna and Gaya. And so I came after the election and conducted a number of interviews with people associated with MIM, of course, and also other local political aspirants, actually. That is the term that I will use today. So I will mainly present individual trajectories of political aspirants. So in that sense, I will look at the very micro level today, but the idea is to try and reflect on broader processes happening in Indian politics in general and in Muslim politics in India. Some of the objectives of today's talk is to make sense of the transformations of local youth leadership among Muslims. And as I just said, to see how these inform us on broader changes in Indian politics and in Muslim politics in India. And I am looking at political aspirants from the point of view of the question of entrance into politics. So what kind of strategies do they adopt in trying to eke out a space for themselves? What do they rely on in order to carve a space for themselves? How can we characterize them? And of course, and it's something that I put in the title, but how has the context of increased polarization, Hindu-Muslim polarization in the last decade, but in the last decades, and in particular after the beginning of the second term of Prime Minister Modi and the Shaheen Bagh anti-CEA protest movement. So I will. So let me just say a few words about the field. So as I said, I have been conducting fieldwork in Simanchal, but as you will see, I also stepped because Simanchal touches West Bengal and the Bengal elections were coming up. So I also spent some time in Bengal, right on the other side of the border in Islampur, which is in Uttar Dinajpur district. Otherwise, I've been conducting fieldwork in Kishanganj and Araria, which are two of the districts that of the 4 districts that form Simanchal, right? Two of the 4 districts of Simanchal. Simanchal has a strong Muslim population, between 40 and 70%, depending on the area, on the constituency you're looking at. The area has been long politically important for Muslims. MPs and MLAs from the region are often Muslim, and important Muslim leaders and figures were elected previously on the Kishanganj seat, the Lok Sabha seats, such as Syed Shahabuddin or Syed Shanawaz Hussain with the BJP. And in the region, in October 2020, MIM managed to make inroads and to win 5 seats. Moreover, I think Simanchal is interesting because it's an example of a majority in the minority. That is, it's a location where the minority in India, the Muslim minority, locally forms a majority. And this raises, of course, certain theoretical questions. Just to make it very concrete, for instance, the question of security is often deemed to be an important one for Muslim voters. But here, in the context where Muslims form a majority, the question of individual security on trains or the question of mob lynchings and so on does not really arise. So we might ask then, what is the need for Muslim politics in such an area? Because it's almost a given that the elected representatives will be Muslim. Just a few more words on the region. So Simanchal is a very rural and poor areas. It has very low indicators. It has a poor road network with a recurrent issue of floods that break bridges. Now, I will introduce 4 and in fact 5 political aspirants, 4 political aspirants and 1 person who is a bit more senior. And I think we can also, I'm happy to discuss other personalities that I may have interacted with in the region in the course of fieldwork. Now, these looking at these individual trajectories, the idea is to look at the micro level and to link it with more macro or meso transformations. So I will follow 2 broad lines of questioning. One is a very general, questioning around the form of politics, the form that Indian politics takes, and to what extent these young political aspirants can fit in the Naya Neta model proposed by Anirudh Krishna. And the second line of inquiry will be more precisely on Muslim politics, and with a driving question around whether we are witnessing a move towards a unification of Muslim politics and of Muslim voters. All right, so let me start directly with the question of the entrance into politics and these four young political aspirants, which will be the first half of the presentation. Scholarship on Indian politics has long stressed the central role of kinship and patronage networks in the way electoral politics functions in India. Consequently, scholars have tended to argue that Indian politics and voter behavior in particular is not ideologically driven, but responds to the prospects of personal benefits resulting from the voting process and resulting from personal ties with the elected representatives. Recent scholarship, however, has questioned these long-standing tropes. On the question of ideology, a recent book by Rahul Verma and Pradeep Chibbar has argued that it would be a mistake to understand Indian politics as free of ideological dynamics. In particular, they have highlighted the rise of Hindutva in the last decades and how it impacted the ideological spectrum. And on the question of kinship and patronage networks, Anirudh Krishna famously asked a couple of decades ago, what is happening to caste? His question stemmed from a dual and contradictory observation. On the one hand, some scholars say that caste is weakening as an organizational and political unit. On the other hand, other scholars point to the growing relevance of caste as a basis for collective mobilization. Krishna's response to this interrogation was to identify a new group of what he termed non-caste-based political entrepreneurs, which he called Naye Neta. And he distinguished Naye Neta from other types of local leaders, political party officials, traditional patrons, judgemans, elected panchayat officials, and caste leaders. With this in mind, the question is whether we observe this and to what extent do these young political aspirants fit in the Naye Neta model? And what do these individual trajectories tell us about broad transformations? So let us look directly at a first individual trajectory, that of Faisal. So Faisal is in his mid-1930s and comes from a locally well-established family of the Sikra caste, so a Sheikh caste considered locally dominant. They own land and some relatives are involved in PACS elections, so primary agriculture credit cooperative societies, which have an importance locally. His grandfather was an MLA, Advocate Yassin, and his uncle, Haider Yassin, was active in politics and quite popular until his sudden death in a car accident in June 2020. Faisal told me that he studied in Jamia and claimed to be among the first organizers of these anti-CAA demonstrations at the Shaheen Bagh and Jamia protest sites. Others told me he didn't study in Jamia, though I haven't been able to really clarify this point. But since January 2020, Faisal has been attempting to build himself a public persona at the local level. And he has done so by pressuring local authorities through social media campaigns. So he launched an initiative called Araria Ka Mudda. So for which he called on a lot of his local contacts and friends, principally young, educated friends of his, and to establish a collective. His idea is that every time a person or a politician raises a national issue, they should also raise a local issue at the same time. So what Faisal does is he directly calls out local political or administrative authorities through direct action. For instance, he once locked the block administration office to request a boat for crossing rivers after a bridge had been broken. Another example concerns Araria's town hospital. Faisal obtained information through RTI that there was no ICU, ventilator, no ultrasound. And so he managed to pressurize the civil surgeon and local authorities to improve the situation. And very recently, an announcement was made for a technician to operate the 4 ventilators received through the PM Cares Fund. So Faisal says that he doesn't work against all these officials, but helps them be heard by higher spheres and do their job better. So in the name of Araria Ka Mudda, he sent a letter called the People's Manifesto, which you can see on the left here, Janta Ka Manifesto, to all the candidates ahead of the Bihar 2020 elections. And he managed to get it signed by a number of them, including the ones you can see here, Abidur Rahman, which is the sitting MLA, Congress MLA. So the letter requested them to commit on a list of 11 local issues from the Mahananda Basin Project, issues of drugs, issues of sports and recreation infrastructure, issues of roads, primary health centers, and so on. And so Faisal also launched a foundation named after his uncle, the Haider Yassin Foundation, which when I was there in February was not yet registered. And so what we see is that Faisal tries to carve out a space for himself, mainly by putting pressure on elected officials and administrators. It is actually interesting to observe that such issue-based politics can be conducted through a kind of civil society activism. However, Faisal also plans to enter the political domain. He has been campaigning for the Panchayat elections, which are apparently postponed to October in Bihar. And so this points to the fact that even young, educated people who can get things done cannot ignore the elected mandate and in fact aspire to it. So we're looking obviously at political aspirants here. So that's in a way it's the criteria of selection. It's a bit different from the local village leaders that Anirudh Krishna looks at. But still, I think it does point to the centrality of the elected mandate as a way to get things done, to enter politics, to get personal benefits as well. So when I was in Araria in February, I went along with Faisal several evenings to various village markets with him as he was clearly starting his campaign for the upcoming Panchayat elections. He sought to mobilize his uncle's fame, my presence as well, and to also capitalize on the aura given by Jamia and Shaheen Bagh, that I'll get back to this later on. So one of the advantages of his activism and the fact that the Panchayat elections in Bihar do not involve officially political parties is that he can create a space for himself with his own platform. He doesn't need to be politically affiliated, and this allows him in a way to be ideologically free. And so, however, I would like to also note that Faisal comes from a fairly well-established family and from a dominant caste. So the idea that caste doesn't matter or caste networks don't play a role here, I think it would be too quick a conclusion to come to that. Let me contrast this with another trajectory, that of Tabriz. Tabriz comes from a village in Araria district that falls in Jokihat constituency. He is a Kulhaya, which is the caste that is numerically dominant in Jokihat constituency, but considered lower than Sekra, and is listed in Bihar as EBC, or extremely backward class. His father was Mukhya at some point in time, and his uncles are involved in the local panchayat. JNU is at the center of Tabriz's political network. He's a PhD student. He's registered as a PhD student, and he was involved in left-wing student politics in JNU with ISA. And he was even elected as joint secretary of the JNU Students' Union. And he does not hesitate to use his JNU network. When we met, he was, for instance, on his way to meet the new superintendent of police because the new SP was a JNUite, and I tagged along, of course. So unlike Faisal, who created his own platform and makes sure that he gets the credit of his actions, Tabriz here remains active, but mainly working for others. He has provided support to left parties and left candidates, often linked with JNU in various recent elections. Kanhaiya Kumar in the Lok Sabha elections, Sandeep Sorav in the 2020 Bihar elections. At the local level, he's also involved in left parties, in particular CPI-ML. We spent a few days together, in fact, as he arranged some interviews for me, and we did meet some CPI-ML workers. There was some kind of a dispute in which Tabrez was called upon as a mediator to solve the dispute. So it's interesting that somebody who has no official political role is taken as a mediator in large part because of his JNU connection and his JNU inheritance. Tabrez also helps out other friends and local politicians. He helped Faisal here and there and provided support to the campaign of Shahnawaz Alam, the MIM candidate in Jokihat constituency, who won and is the sitting MLA. And that is probably because his village falls in that constituency, but also because he comes from the same caste and has a lot of interpersonal connections. It's quite interesting how political circles overlap across parties, and which allow people to move, to have flexibility and even be involved quite at the same time with various groups. Now Tabrez wishes to enter the electoral game, but is not sure with which party to go ahead. Is MIM a good option? At the same time, the safety of Congress and its secular politics seems appealing, but at the same time, Tabrez is very critical of Congress that has let Muslims down over time and hasn't protected them from riots and from the BJP and from the BJP coming to power. So he senses that he should do some kind of activism and social work the way perhaps Faisal does. And he did ask me directly, what would be your advice? What should I do? So I told him he should go for legal activism, but I'm not sure he did my advice so far. So the case of Tabrez highlights the question of the transition after student politics, how to transform oneself into a politician when one has been only mainly doing politics on university campuses. His involvement in public life goes to supporting the political activities of others, and so it's more difficult to create a space for oneself the way Faisal does. A third trajectory that I will highlight now is that of Zubayd in Islampur. Zubayd is in his mid-20s. He is a Bengali who comes from Chopra, and his father is a local elected official and district vice president of the Congress in Chopra. Zubayd lives in Islampur, where he works as a lawyer after studying law in Aligarh. So he was not particularly involved in student politics, but when talking to me, he kept referring to being an alleg and how that gave him a particular status. In particular, he stressed the fact that he got plenty of clients as a lawyer because he was an alleg. So for about 10 years, Zubayd has been associated with local social organizations, welfare organizations, with the clear intention of one day joining politics. So he's this part of an organization called the Raza Committee, which among various social activities arranges regular blood donations, but also organizes protest marches. So here are some of the images of these organizations. He is also later he joined the Darussalam Patriotic Trust, which is also run by young people locally. And some of these organizations like the Raza Committee and Darussalam Patriotic Trust have explicitly Muslim names. Something which is important in understanding the trajectory of Zubayd and how Muslim politics appears to him as an interesting path, having studied at Aligarh and then working as a lawyer, and he's also quite tempted by MIM, although his own father is in Congress. So Zubayd is very conscious of caste dynamics. He says that among Bengalis, caste does not really matter, but he talks about other communities Soljapuris in particular, who are dominant in the Kishanganj district, and Sher Shah Abadis. Sher Shah Abadi is a population that has migrated in the past 50 years or so from other regions of Bengal that speaks a different language and is generally Sunni Alehadi, so has a particular sectarian orientation as well. The Sher Shah Abadi, for instance, Zubayd explains how he keeps good relations with the Sher Shah Abadis and attends meetings of their association, the Islampur Pacific Society, not officially a caste association, but practically it is a caste association in the sense that all the members and all the participants are all Sher Shah Abadi. Now for Zubayd, anti-CEA protests were a turning point. The various organizations in which he participates did establish a local mini Shaheen Bagh, as people referred to at the local level during the winter of 2019-2020. Now, so here in the case of Zubayd, we see that the involvement in public life goes through associational life. And he's very aware that this is a necessary step to enter politics, to create, to turn oneself into a locally important personality, a local figure. He has a clear understanding of local caste dynamics. And on the ideological side, he's quite tempted with Muslim politics, as I mentioned. So if we look at coming back to this idea of Naya Neta and how what is now important in the relation, in the political relation of the state and the citizen are these new intermediaries. So I think keeping that the notion of Naya Neta in mind and looking at these trajectories, it shows that there is a need for people who can get things done, and that has clearly stayed. In a way, we could say that Naya Neta politics has become a standard way for people to enter politics. It's important to do social work and to be able to show it. And these are indeed young, better educated people than the average population. And they have a network at their disposal, often through their university, that allows them to interact with state authorities. Now, there are some differences as well with the Naya Neta model. So whether the emergence of Naya Neta who are able to get things done actually erodes caste networks, to me remains open to question. In our examples, these youngest political aspirants do come from locally dominant castes and from families that have a history of political engagement. I think what appears important in this trajectory is the need to start politics by getting into a kind of social work. That's the way to carve out a space for oneself, build a network, gain a reputation. And here the trajectory of Tabrez is a case in point, precisely because he has not been able to achieve this. While he has clear abilities for organizational party work, he is not really involved in social work and local organizations, which may explain why he's going through a phase of confusion and not moving forward politically. Finally, I think an important element is the continued relevance of the elected office. In a sense, I would tend to think that Naya Neta are not content in their role as Naya Neta, but inspired to win an electoral mandate. Thus, acting as intermediary or service provider appears as a platform to enter politics, not an end in itself. There are, now let me move on a bit to the question of Muslim politics. Okay, I think somebody drew on the screen, but it's okay, let me leave it. So the first, I talked about these young political aspirants with the notion of Naya Neta and how they fit or not in that model. Now let us look at Muslim politics. But first, I think it's important to put in place what I call the meta-narrative of Muslim representation in India after independence. To sum up this meta-narrative, and to make it short, it tells the story of Indian Muslims' massive support to the Congress Party after the country's independence in 1947 and up until the 1980s. This is due to the fact that in the aftermath of partition, mobilizing politically on the basis of religion was not possible, was not acceptable for Muslims at all. After the trauma of partition, the Muslim League was discredited and was only revived in Kerala. The Majlis that we mentioned was banned for several years until it was revived in the late 50s. Now, various organizations did emerge over time in the 60s and 70s, but not political parties really, and some attempts were made, but they were not able to in the Muslim in the electoral and political game. Now, from the 80s, Muslims then turned towards regional political parties based on caste identity, and this led to the famous MY or Muslim Yadav equation in Bihar, with Muslims largely supporting the RJD or the Rashtriya Janata Dal. We may think of Muslim support to the Samajwadi Party in Uttar Pradesh as well. In addition, in this meta-narrative, there's this idea that Muslims largely support the Indian conception of secularism, which guarantees specific rights to religious minorities. And finally, I should also mention that the narrative of Muslim representation in independent India needs to take into account the fact that there has been a constant underrepresentation, numerical representation of Muslims in elected offices, as well as in state institutions, administration, justice, police, and so on. Now, a certain number of scholars have started to argue in the past, in the last recent years, that there has been a shift in the recent decades in Muslim politics. So, for instance, a scholar called Arndt Emmerich argued in a book on the PFI, the Popular Front of India, so a South India-based Muslim social organization, which also has a political party called SDPI. So he argued that there has been a shift from what he called Muslim identity politics to Muslim citizenship politics. What he means by that is that there was it's a bit schematic, but that there was a former kind of Muslim identity politics in which the ulema, that means the religious scholars, occupied a central stage, and they basically managed the relationship party and ensured the support to the Congress party. And it was also a kind of politics centered on symbolic issues. According to Emmerich, there has been a change towards Muslim citizenship politics in which the Muslims have become more assertive and basically entered rights-based mobilization, in which they claim certain rights based on the Indian constitution and citizenship. Now, I share some of his assessment, but I would argue that in large part, this shift may not be specific to Muslims. It may have to do, especially when it comes to becoming more assertive and rights-based mobilization, which is linked with the proliferation of a number of social organizations across the country. I think it has to do with a lot of with general dynamics, like the politics of quota, which sparked of a number of caste-based organizations, including among Muslims, including in Simachal, but also it has to do with the privatization of education and the development of large educational trusts. So when it comes to Muslim politics, one of the questions that people now raise is that of the unification of Muslim politics. Are we witnessing a move towards Muslim politics coming on one platform, Muslim voters, being consolidated to vote only one side, the context of increased polarization in the last decade may favor this trend. And we also have witnessed a growth in popularity and in electoral capacity of the Majlis of MIM, which precisely now seeks to position itself not as a Hyderabad-based party only, but as a pan-Indian party for Muslims. Owaisi does state very clearly that, according to him, Muslims do need a single political platform. A number of critics claim that this participates in a kind of polarization or response to the Hindu vote consolidation sought by the BJP. Moreover, we have also seen a number of other Muslim parties, so we might ask what makes them Muslim, but I think we can debate that in the Q&A. But other Muslim parties have seen the light of the day in the 2000s. The Peace Party, the Welfare Party, for instance, SDPI, of course, the AIUDF in Assam. So I think what this points to, rather than unification, is perhaps that there are new forms that Muslim politics take, and that the new forms that we are seeing is, and so the emergence of parties that seek to mobilize Muslims as Muslim, that is explicitly calling on Muslimness as a way of gaining their support, and also that seek to gain bargaining power for Muslims in this way, so as not to be subservient or dependent on one single political party, the Congress in particular. Now, before concluding, I think I don't have that much time left, so I'll try to make this short. But before concluding, I'll say a few words on the rise of MIM in Bihar and on the Shaheen Bagh moment. I think I'll bring in one more trajectory to illustrate the rise of MIM in Simanchal in Bihar. Seen from afar, it may be tempting to conclude that there is a rise of a sort of unified Muslim politics, but MIM has been very apt locally at gaining people from various political parties and locally important figures, political workers that had years of or decades of experience with other parties. An example is that of Gulshan Ara, who joined MIM for a brief while, in fact. She joined in January 2020, and she had left the BJP. She was with the BJP for about 7 years and left because of the CAA and during the anti-CAA protests. She is an elected local member. First, she was a panchayat member, then she became a member of the Zila Parishad. And she was hoping she might get a ticket from the MIM ahead of the assembly elections, but she didn't. But when I met her, what she stressed, it was not only the fact that she didn't get the ticket, in fact, that she didn't mention that as an important matter, but she was very critical of the fact that the party sold tickets to the highest bidder. And the story is that in that constituency, in fact, the whole thing was finalized. A certain Murshid Saab was given a ticket. Owaisi, Asaduddin Owaisi, had already tweeted and announced that he would be the candidate. And the day before the nomination, he gave it. It was announced that the ticket would finally be given to somebody else, Shanawaz Alam, the son of local political patriarch Taslimuddin. Now, what this shows is that MIM very aptly relied on local existing political networks for the worse or the better, but it did work pretty well here. But also another element that we have to keep in mind is that the rise of MIM in Simanchal is not obvious and is not necessarily it doesn't mean that MIM will always be considered as a great political option. For instance, when I was in Islampur, there was a clear sense with discussion with people there and in interviews that in spite of their clear sympathies and interest in MIM, and in particular Zubayd, whom I mentioned, this was not the right time for MIM to come in because there was too strong a risk of clearing the path for the BJP by dividing the Muslim vote, and that it was necessary for the Muslim vote to be united behind the Trinamool Congress in those recent elections. So there is a clear popularity of Owaisi, but this does not necessarily translate into votes. It is tempting for young political aspirants to join MIM, and even a person like Tabrez, who is associated with left politics, wonders whether MIM would be a nice option, whether it could give him political options. But MIM victories in Simanchala are often due in large part to local dynamics, such as anti-incumbency, money power, as well of various candidates. Final point before concluding, the question of Shaheen Bagh and its legacy. I think it did represent a very important point in recent years, and it's something clearly that cuts across political parties and generations, but that among the youth very strongly resonates. Of course, MIM was part of that in the sense that Asaduddin Owaisi sort of tried to project himself as the champion of the opposition to that bill. And some of his stunts did resonate among people, such as the tearing of the bill in parliament, which a number of people remember very strongly. But for the young political aspirants, it was also a formative moment, in the sense that many of them seek to harness the aura that the participation in the anti-CAA protests give, or that they think that they will gain respect out of that. And this really, it became clear in my mind when Faisal, that I mentioned first, started telling people that we had both met at Shaheen Bagh, which was not true, but it was interesting. That's when I really understood that it was important for him to project himself as having been associated with the Shaheen Bagh protests, and that he expected to get some kind of political mileage out of that. Another element is the involvement in local NGOs, and how many of these local NGOs participated in the organization, in the replication of the Shaheen Bagh protest at the local level, whether in Araria, in Kishanganj, or in Islampur. There were some local dharnas that were organized with speeches in the evening and so on. All right, so Shaheen Bagh does represent a very important symbol, I think, in the political imagination among Muslims in the region. And consequently, political aspirants seek to tie themselves to these protests in order to harness some legitimacy and improve their reputation. But we should also mention, and to stress that point, that the question of CAA and RC also proved the liability for Muslim candidates who were with the JDU in the last Bihar Assembly elections. And in particular here, I'll mention the incumbent Mujahid Alam in Kochadaman seat, who lost to MIM, although through my conversations with people locally, it appeared that he was very popular and that he had a lot of respect and was considered as an MLA who was very active and who would precisely get things done. But still, his association with JDU cost him his seat. Let me conclude before we can have the Q&A. Oops, sorry. All right. So to a few words of conclusion. I tried in the presentation to link the the micro level individual trajectories to broader observations about changes taking place in politics in India and in Muslim politics in particular. The trajectories of young political aspirants show that the Naya Neta model seems to, in a way, have institutionalized itself. Maybe it was a certain moment in time, and that now it has become, I would say, almost a pattern that people reproduce, in the sense that they entering politics has to go through doing some kind of social work, often through local civil society organizations. Now, there's a question that I did not have the time to develop, but that I would like to explore in the future, is that of the question of NGOization of local politics. And I do think that there has been a proliferation, as I mentioned, of local organizations. And usually the notion of NGOization is generally used for the institutionalization of social movements into NGOs, in particular the women's movement. But here I see NGOization not as the institutionalization of a social movement, but as a kind of form through which local politics and particularly the entrance into politics takes place. However, I do think that caste networks and belonging still play a role in this process. In particular, political aspirants not only tend to come from established families and dominant caste, but also they do take into account caste calculations in their political strategies. Now, is there a kind of unification of Muslim politics taking place? I think that the case of these political aspirants shows that Shaheen Bagh has become an important symbol, as I said, and that political aspirants think they'll gain politically by showing their association with the protests. The rise of MIM in the region offers a tempting option for political aspirants. It does spark hope in some, but many of them also remain cautious, as they want to be sure that their association with MIM will carry forward their political career. But perhaps as the last remark and the concluding word, I think what is important is probably in an important change in Muslim politics is the idea that Muslims need to be in a position in which they can negotiate their political alliance. This may imply a political unification of Muslims, but not necessarily at the national level. We may think, as Professor Suri mentioned in the opening remarks, but we may think that with a fractured political system and with regional party systems, we might think that a consolidation of Muslim votes could happen behind different parties according to different and to the region. I hope that I did respond to some of the opening questions, and I'm happy to discuss any of those points, of course, in the discussion. I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julien. You have given us some very relevant, very useful observations from the field. This is the kind of research we require, which gives us a broad picture, but grounded firmly in the empirical reality at the local level. I think you have tried to bridge these two, building certain narratives based on your field work at a local level, at a district or constituency level, to linking them up to understanding the big picture, the national level, patterns of Muslim politics. As you clearly said, that it has three interlinked components, in what you said. One is the emergence of the political aspirants at the local level among the Muslims, but whose character is different today from the kind of Muslim leaders before. As you said, that these are all people who are looking at to enter into politics through improving the situation or living conditions of the Muslims or catering to their needs. And you have taken Anirudh Krishna's, Naya Neta's category. One thing which I find a little bit, maybe you may reflect on that if you think it is worthwhile. Naya Neta, Anirudh Krishna uses to a leader what you call political entrepreneur who transcends the caste barriers, caste and class barriers. So it's actually a Naya Neta is opposite of politics based on any social identity. So it is not the social identity. What Anirudh Krishna argues in that book or in his research is that social identities are ceasing to be salient in politics. It's actually the work people do to attend to the daily needs or to the problems of people at the local level. That's how these leaders emerge. Maybe there is some common ground between the kind of leaders which you're talking of, Tabriz and others, Zubayd and others, and the Naya Netas, the kind of Naya Netas which Anirudh Krishna speaks of. But I thought that issue of how you address that a leader at the local level can work on the political dimensions of sectarian identity along with catering to their needs or attending to their problems at the local level, while claiming himself to be a Muslim or whatever identity. It could be a scheduled caste or it could be a backward caste, etc. There's one point that came to my mind hearing what you said. Of course, the second component, you talked of the rise of MIM as not, although it is a Hyderabad-based party, but trying to expand itself in other territories. But I think you presented a very nuanced understanding of why this party has become somewhat popular, not only in Bihar, but in Maharashtra as well. But I thought, how do we really also look at continuities? I think that's one. What made Asaduddin Owaisi a kind of a popular leader among Muslim elites? It's not just among the local people, but so what made him to capture? In Hyderabad, we know that there were two parties in Hyderabad in 1940s which wanted secession from India. One was Communist Party, another was Majlis Party. And the Communist Party, because it wanted to establish a liberated socialist state. Sundaraya wrote a famous book on that. And Majlis wanted to have their own Islamic state. But both became nationalist much later. Majlis became All India MIM. So they added All India in 1967. And the communists also became very nationalist, saying that we will not allow the country to be broken. It should be broken only when our bodies are broken, something like that. So what is the, there is some change, but is there a continuity in stoking up these fears of Muslims not being represented by non-Muslims in either in assemblies or local level or in the parliament? So I just thought, but there are colleagues in the department who have greater interest in these aspects. I know Professor Manjari Kadzu has been working on this subject for quite some time, and we have Professor Arun Patnaik. I don't know whether Arun has joined today. But, Sneha, is Arun there? I don't see him. he also worked on kind of these issues, Muslim identity problems. And we have also Professor Sanjay Palshekar, who has edited a volume recently on not exactly on leadership, but the questions of communalism and Hindu-Muslim conflict, etc. So we have, and I also remember Professor Kailash writing a book review of, Kailash, he wrote a book review of Adnan Farooqi's work, Elites and Masses book, isn't it? Where they talked of how new kinds of leaders are emerging at the local level. So I request my colleagues to we'll gather a few questions, Julien, if you like, and then how do you want to respond?
Anything works for me. I can respond to questions one after the other, or we can club them if it's more efficient for time.
We have, I think, Sneha, how long can we go? We can go up to another 30-40 minutes easily, isn't it?
Yeah, up to 4 o'clock or so.
No, 4 o'clock or so. Yeah. So may I invite my colleagues to, if they have any questions or observations or to make on this?
Maybe I could respond to some of the points you just raised to start.
Sorry, I thought after you respond, I mean,
no, please go ahead.
The mic wasn't open, so Julien, I'm sorry, I joined a little late, so I've just interrupted. So just go on, and then I'll come in after that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Yes. I think on the notion of Naya Neta, I think what you pointed is exactly right, and that is also the question that I had in mind. It was, I know that Anirudh Krishna, precisely what he wanted to stress was the fact that there's a progressive erosion of the salience of castes in the practice of politics. But I think, yes, so what I tried to say is to highlight the fact that the need to get things done is central, I think, in the people I interacted with. But nonetheless, I do think that some of, I don't think that other forms of belonging and the networks that result from those entirely disappear. So I think the solving people's problems does not erase, at least in those cases, does not erase the fact that caste belonging does play a role. But I think what I highlighted is that it plays a role in political calculations. It plays a role in perhaps which candidates are going to be chosen by political parties in various constituencies. Now, I don't have really a response on the even lower level, which is what Anirudh Krishna actually talks about, is at the village level. So what he talks about is how at the village level, if what you need is young educated people who can take you to the block headquarters to get your paperwork done, right? And in fact, these Naineta don't have political ambitions precisely, which is why he distinguishes them from elected panchayat members or from politicians or members of political parties. Of course, here, I've been looking at people who have political ambitions. It's interesting that they do, that they think, for instance, that their entry into politics has to go through such kind of social work and helping solving people's problems, and also solving collective problems at the local level, rather than say, being associated with an established leader and working your way up under the shadow of an established political leader. And on the question of the continuity and MIM, well, you raised the question of the popularity of OAC among Muslim elites and the popularity of MIM. I think here there's a clear generational difference, not necessarily among elites, but in general. I mean, in Simanchal, that was something that came across many discussions, was the fact that the youth was very enthusiastic about MIM and OAC, but the older generation was a bit more skeptical and in fact was more fearful of polarization and preferred the safe Congress route. Now, with the continuity over time, I think you said what is interesting here, and also in the new Muslim parties that we've seen in the past 15 years, as well as in MIM, and is I think the opposing or trying to not be dependent on Congress. And for instance, if we take the AIUDF in Assam, the party All India United Democratic Front, which was founded in 2006, it was founded by a cleric, Badruddin Ajmal, who is also a business tycoon or has a large perfume company. And he's trained at Deoband, and has been associated with Jamiatul Ulema Hind, so one of the major religious organizations that has a long historical connection with the Congress party. But I think that the creation of this party in Assam, and Badruddin Ajmal is in fact closer to Mahmoud Madni, and the JUH, the Jamiatul Ulema, split into factions. One, I think, following the classic proximity with Congress that it has always played, and the new faction with Mahmoud Madni being more engaged in politics, ready to do different kinds of alliances, and who invests more in politics than in religious study or training. And so I think, for example, the case of that party in Assam does show so that what matters is not to want to play the old game with Congress. And so I think that's how parties like MIM, the Muslim League, and AIUDF, as well as new Muslim parties, I think that's where they have some kind of commonality, is seeking to appeal to Muslim voters as Muslims, and to gain, to consolidate the vote so as to be able to bargain with various parties across the board, including Congress, but not to count Muslims as taken for granted in favor of the Congress party. Sorry, Professor Suri, we cannot hear you.
Professor Suri, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. No, I just said I saw a few hands going up. Before I invite participants to ask questions, may I ask them to just say one sentence about introducing them, so that the speaker and others also would know you. So I request Ranu Jain to ask the question.
I'm Ranu Jain from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I'm a faculty member there. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ranu Jain, we can hear you.
It's a very interesting study, I must say, and I'm looking forward to reading your thesis and your work. But I have a few queries which I would like to have your response on. One is, you see, why university base? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the fact that university students are taking a lead in uh, in leading the Muslim community, especially in anti-CAA movement and in human rights movement. And this citizenship is also not a class-based citizenship anymore. They want their space in the rightist Hindu dominant national citizenship which is being promoted today. They are saying that I have a right to wear a hijab and to talk about secularism. I have a right to be acknowledged as a Muslim. uh, the manner in which, I mean, along with my identity, along with my cultural specification, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that they are changing the discourse in the nation, and somewhere it is coming out as a cosmopolitan discourse, and somewhere it is coming out as a very Muslim discourse, especially when this discourse slips out of university and starts unifying the community members, like all these rallies that took place. In the beginning, of course, we saw mainly students, but later on, Muslim community members started participating in it, as we also saw in the case of Shaheen Bagh. So, this is one of my questions. Why and how do you look at the role that university students are playing in Muslim politics or new leadership that is coming up? My second question is, you were talking about unification, but I feel that one of the largest problems or the challenges that the Muslims are facing today is that the community is not unified. We have read work of Rashiduddin Khan, we have read Hunter Commission report, where they're showing that there is a stark difference between the Muslim elite. I'm using the word elite because that makes us more easily understandable to people. So there is a there is there's a racial, cultural, class difference between the elite and the people, and somewhere this difference has not been able to managed yet. Like even in an institution like TISS, you see, I did not see a very cohesive front of Muslims. They were together in a cosmopolitan space protesting against CAA, but I have not seen, like in the case of Ambedkar Student Association, a platform where Muslims were coming together to develop a pan Indian identity, to talk about the issues that are confronting them. Kashmiri Muslims were not with Bihari Muslims were not with Keralite Muslims. There were so many ideological differences, there were different political affiliations, and I think the fact that the Muslim population is scattered has to be dealt with if Muslims have to present themselves in the power politics of the nation, especially before the rightist ideology.
Okay.
So should I go ahead and respond?
Yes.
Thank you very much. These are absolutely relevant questions. So on the role of university student leaders, I think so. What I did highlight in the presentation was the fact that among the people that I met, several of them, I mean all of them, in fact, do refer to a university connection and a central university connection. So Jamia, Aligarh, JNU. And so either they refer to it as part of their campaign or in their dealings, or they also use the network from these universities in their own practical dealings. So I mentioned that example of Tabriz going to the SP just because he was a JNU person. I could cite a few more examples. A similar situation happened in Kishanganj. The SP of Kishanganj is also conducting a PhD in JNU in French, in fact. So that is another connection, and a lot of people, get referring to that person. Now, I didn't mention either, but Tabriz, in fact, was also, I mean, his name has also been mentioned in the Delhi riots charge sheet. So although of course, there's no personal direct involvement or anything, but there's this association with that moment, whether in JNU and in Shaheen Bagh. So the question whether really we are seeing a new leadership, a new youth leadership emerging, I think is the core question here. But it will take maybe a few more years to be able to really respond to this. But I do think that it was a formative moment for many people, either at the intellectual level, I think, to understand, as you said, that the right to wear a hijab or to be visibly Muslim and to assert a Muslim identity, and talk of secularism and talk of citizenship. So I think the way it will really play out, we have to see. But at the local level, I do think also it did have an impact in terms of organization, and because all these local organizations did participate in organizing mini protests on the Shaheen Bagh model. So I think it was a formative experience for young people, not only in universities, but also in places like Kishanganj, Araria, or Islampur. On the question of unification and division among Muslims, I think, I mean, you're pointing to a very salient fact, and clearly unifying the Muslim community under one banner has always been an important political bone of contention and difficulty for Muslim leaders. Of course, it was difficult for the Muslim League to unite Muslims before independence under the project in favor of Pakistan. And, you know, there's this famous discrepancy between the support of the Muslim League, which came from minority provinces where Muslims were in minority, and the fact that the regions that became Pakistan were a majority provinces where the support for the Muslim League was not very strong. And the question of internal divisions is something that I've been I've been grappling with precisely, and the issue of caste, I think, is central. I didn't talk much here about the Pasmanda politics, because of course, Pasmanda politics has recently somewhat subdued. It's not what it used to be in the late 90s and 2000s, when there was a lot of talk about it. But there are, what exists is a lot of caste-based local organizations which do welfare work, but also who are involved in politics. And I think these generally do not remain non-ideological. They eventually side in favor of Muslims, in the sense that they do not deal with all political parties, and they end up opposing BJP, even when they claim to be non-ideological. So that's I think the whole question for a person like Owaisi and the rise of MIM is precisely how to deal with local difference of caste, of sect across India, when if you want to be the sole spokesman, to use Aisha Jalal's term that she used for for Jinnah, if you want to be the sole spokesman for Muslims in India, then you have to deal with a great deal of diversity, and you have to be able to address that. And when I said that the rise of MIM largely relies on a very shrewd understanding of local dynamics and of who are the power holders, who are the dominant castes, and who are the dominant religious networks, that is what I wanted to point to. I think that MIM has a very unitary discourse at the macro level, but its rise has to go through local adaptation and local strategies.
Thank you. Yeah, now I request Shailaja Tandon to ask the question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Hi, Julian. Thank you for the talk. I worked at CSH, and I had two concerns. My first was, When you talk about NGOization in local politics, as far as my understanding goes, that NGOization as a process started way back in 1990s with the opening of the economy, with the flow of aid, and particularly first in the social sector with various development programs, and later on it spilled over to the political sphere. What I wanted to understand, because I did a bit of fieldwork in Bihar elections too, was that more than NGOization, don't you feel there's more a grassroots level or a grassroots growth, which has a more local essence as compared to NGOization with more of an external intervention? My first question was that, because I'm trying to also conceptualize, and I feel we are moving more towards that end, and people are understanding what NGOization means, even at the local level. I mean, they know these words, they know civil society, they are developing their understanding, and they are themselves becoming their own spokesperson. My second question was the category of Naya Neta that you have brought in. It's interesting to understand this, because as I said, that I did my sort of a fieldwork in the Bihar elections in Ratnauli. Uh, I was sort of thinking that doesn't this coincide a lot with Max Weber's third category of leadership, which is the charismatic leader, where you're taking the domain of uh, work. I mean, you're trying to do social work. You're trying, because that is precisely where our leaders have lacked, and it is a sort of a gap for them to enter and be able to gain the trust that is a very important aspect of a charismatic leader, and also belonging next, because uh, a charismatic leader, if it comes from its own community, is much more revered and trusted as opposed to an external leader. And this was very prevalent in the Muslim voters preferences, because the whole essence of trust was very important. So I just wanted to know about this, and thank you for the talk.
Thank you very much, Shelja, for the questions. On NGOization, I think it's very right what you're pointing to. There's a clear question of definition, and it is true that NGOization, with the term NGO, does carry the meaning or the connotation that it comes from outside, that it's external funding, and that NGOs come with an agenda. And what we're seeing here is a bottom-up dynamic of locally based initiatives which try to make a change at the local level and do not necessarily seek, that is an aspect I haven't yet explored, but external funding, it's not, I think you can contrast them with different kinds of organizations, like existing NGOs. So for instance, I mean, there are some, in Kishanganj, I know of some NGOs who are linked with families of politicians, and they do get external funding and so on. They're more in the classic mold of NGOs. And clearly what we're seeing with all the small organizations that I referred to is a different dynamic. And you can also distinguish it from caste-based organization, which also function differently. On the category of Naya Neta and the notion of charismatic leader, thank you. It's been a while since I've read Max Weber, but in my understanding, I would tend to think that the charismatic leader does not necessarily need to get work done to get a following, but precisely because of a charismatic aura which allows for the following. But I hope we can have a further discussion on this point at some later point.
Thank you. Before I go to Samik Rai Chaudhary, who has raised hand sign, there is a comment in the chat box by Adil Wani. Could you be able to read that in the chat box? So can you take a minute and read his comment in the chat box?
All right, so let me, should I read it out loud?
Yes, I can do that for you, so that you can say, you can relax a little bit. He says that, yeah, Adil, why don't you speak? I think he's here, so we can as well ask him to speak. Adil, Vani, can you just speak what you have written so that we know, we can hear you firsthand? Yeah.
Okay, sir. So I'm a student of politics at this department. So basically, I did my graduation from Aligarh Muslim University, and there I saw, some changes in the political imagination of Muslims, where the identity, it got sharpened mostly because of the anti-CAA movement and the question of like the CAA, it questioned the Muslim identity there. So what I saw that, AIM, how AIM was perceived before and after anti-CAA. So it was seen as a vote cut, like in UP or in Bihar. Here in UP in terms of Samajwadi Party, because Muslims mostly they vote for BSP or SP, and in Bihar it is usually RJD. So there they saw that it is a vote cut, so we don't have to vote for it. It does not represent Muslims. But after CAA, it came to the fore. This AIM, it was involved in protests everywhere in the country. So this perception, it got changed. It was seen as the only party that could represent Muslims in the Indian politics or in the state level politics. So my question lastly it is that, how could these student politics in the university campuses, how could it shape or influence the AIM's future in UP and Bihar and Bengal? And also one thing you did not mention, I think it does not come, he is not from Simanchal, Mashkur Usmani. He was a president, student union president there. I'm quite baffled by this question that when AIMM was rising in the, its support base was rising in the university campus, Mashkur Usmani, he still chose to join Congress. And the question is that, how much does secular calculations and concerns of enlarging vote base beyond Muslims play into such choices? Also, like apart from Mashkur Usmani, there are other student leaders who choose to join SP and BSP rather than AIMIM. But there is also support for AIM in the student community, and also like when they win, they join the Congress because they know that AIMIM, it does not have that much political clout in the states.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Adil, for these questions. I'll start with the second one. So why do people choose parties other than MIM when they want to enter? Why do young Muslim political aspirants choose parties other than MIM when they want to enter the political fray? As I think you had the answer in a way in your question. I mean, the fact that MIM, as you said, doesn't have that much political clout, and I think it's also a question of trajectory. So not individual this time, but at the party level. And if there is the feeling that the party is on the rise and that it will create opportunities, I think that clearly helps attract people. I think what MIM really managed to do at the local level in Simanchal is to get old political workers from Congress who had been, district president of Congress for 10 years. So they managed to get one guy like this on one side. On the other hand, they got some panchayat members. So they got people who had a very long experience of local politics. They got people who were long associated with Taslimuddin, so who was the political patriarch, also quite a controversial figure with a lot of criminal allegations and so on, as well as his two sons, one of whom is the sitting MLA in Jokiat. So I think what you're pointing to is the transition from the idea of politics that people have and their ambitions, and also what they hope, what political parties make them hope that the way things can change, and when they have to take concrete steps into you don't want to support a losing party. I mean, it depends, of course, but generally, if you are going to invest time and money and energy into getting into politics, you would rather do something that has strong chances to win. I think that there is also a fear of polarization that remains, and that is something that came across in many discussions. You say that the perception of MIM has changed, but it managed to gain clearly a lot of popularity after the CEA protests and even a bit before that. But still, allegations of vote cutting were all around during the Bihar elections. So I think it is still perceived as, or at least its opponents feel that it will cut votes. And what we saw in the recent Bengal elections were also this. I mean, and just to repeat what I said, that in Islampur, clearly all the young people that I encountered were all very much sympathetic with MIM. And they kept saying, if Owaisi comes tomorrow, does a rally, he'll get 50,000 people to come and see him, but they won't vote for him. Because at this juncture, the fear of BJP coming in and dividing the Muslim vote precisely, and so weakening the Trinamool, that fear was very strong. How can student politics influence MIM? I don't have really an answer right now, but I'm coming back to what I mentioned earlier about the networks and so on, but I think it would be interesting to explore that dimension.
Thank you. Now, may I ask Samik Rai Chaudhary to
yes,
ask
sir.
this question? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Hello, I'm from Institute of Development Studies, Calcutta. I'm doing my MPhil from there presently. So I'm asking this question because you mentioned the Shaheen Bagh protest, and obviously they gained a lot of media attention and to a large extent became a flashpoint for Muslim identity, which was very unique in contemporary politics. But the discourse of Shaheen Bagh was very different from the discourse that was present or that has been going on in Assam. Now that becomes important because Assam is the only state which has experienced the bureaucratic process of NRC. And the NRC in Assam was largely accepted because of the discourse of linguistic polarization that has existed in Assam since the colonial times, since early 20th century. So how do you, plus in Assam, we see that there was a demand for a mini NRC where the certain Muslim groups demanded that a mini NRC be conducted to differentiate indigenous Muslim groups from Bengali speaking Muslim groups. So how do you see Muslim politics playing out in states like Assam or Bengal, where there are where linguistic politics or politics on language and linguistic polarization is predominant? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating question. Really, we talked earlier about AIUDF, the All India United Democratic Front, so the Assam-based party. So I don't know exactly what the AIUDF, what was their official position on the question of CA NRC. And I know that indeed, as you mentioned, some Muslim groups and some Muslim student organizations in Assam did support the NRC, and that as you very clearly said, linguistic polarization trumps perhaps the Hindu-Muslim dimension. The AIUDF has the perception of being a party of Bengali-speaking Muslims in Assam and of doing the work of Bengalis. And there is also this general perception that Bengalis are more religiously conservative, and that Assamese Muslims are the true indigenous sons of the soil and are not so traditionalist or are not so religiously bent. Now, I think that I don't really have an answer to your question, to be honest, but I think it's an excellent case of how the linguistic or the ethnic marker can become more salient than the religious one. I think it would require probably in-depth fieldwork in Assam to be able to see how, for instance, the AIUDF plays on these questions of linguistic Assamese or Bengali identity. I know some of the AIUDF politicians have a very Muslim appearance. You have a number of Maulanas who have a beard, and they're associated with the Deoband school of thought. And you have some other leaders who have a very secular appearance, wear a gamcha, and try to appear very, very Assamese. So how this actually concretely plays out on the ground, I think, is a fascinating question.
Good. Now, can I revert back to some of the colleagues? Professor Manjari, do you want to make any observation?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Suri, and thanks for the presentation. I'm sorry that I joined a little late, but I just wanted your thoughts on this particular thing which comes up every now and then when we start theorizing Muslim identity politics in India. I mean, this question often comes up, this binary of unification versus regional specificity. Not only regional specificity, but also ideological specificity. And I see that often. In fact, I used to do that. I did that earlier. I don't know about you, but we start using the frame of Hindu identity politics or Hindutva to look at Muslim politics as well. And that's why this whole thing, starts about unification, that we start expecting unification within Muslim identity politics as well. But if we talk about regional specificity or ideological specificity, and here I want to bring in the examples which you brought yourself when you were talking about the Naya Neta and the recent politics which has happened, which we have seen in the last year and a little more, that we have this very sort of vibrant student politics which has emerged within the Muslim politics, or I won't say particularly Muslim politics, but Muslim leadership, and people are looking up to this as looking up to this particular individual as the future leader, Umar Khalid, and coming from the terrain of student politics and largely a left-wing politics. Then we had the Shaheen Bagh, where your discussion was about that, and that was about citizenship rights and the state and citizenship issues and other civic issues which came up. So that's the other strand which we have been seeing in recent years, and that's largely protest politics which has come up, and Shaheen Bagh is a good example of that. Then we talk about the MIM, and we sort of bring it into the picture because it's the most established, one of the most established Muslim politics in India, and also it's largely right-wing politics. And apart from these three strands, we have regional specificities, like for example, MIM itself in Telangana, then we have the Muslim League in Kerala, then we have different parties in Assam, then Paspanta Muslim coming up there, these configurations coming up in UP and Bihar. So I think when we look at Muslim identity politics from the frame of Hindutva politics, this thing about expecting a unification, every time that it has to be united, because we have at the back of our minds that something has to come up, something very concrete has to come up to take on Hindutva politics. But I think that's something which, we are being a little unfair there, that when we talk about left-wing politics, and we don't talk about it as, Hindu politics, but we have Hindu right-wing on the one hand, which is basically very united. It's one concrete block. But of course, we are seeing fractures there as well with the Shiv Sena, moving ahead, and then there are more extremist fringe groups. But, Muslim politics, why do we expect this unification? And why don't we see them, when we are theorizing about it, more as a regional specific or ideologically specific politics which has various strands. I mean, I have not looked at Muslim politics that closely the way you have, but I, when just pointing this out from my readings of the whole thing. So I don't know what you'll say to that. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. I think you're pointing to an assumption, or that we should look at Muslim politics, or we should expect some kind of unification either. Or I think people like Hilal Ahmed at CSDS has been repeatedly writing that we should stop thinking that Muslims, all are the same and all vote the same way. And this idea that people vote all together in the same way is not that true, and so on. On the other hand, I think there is, what we need is to understand the complexity, but I think the question of unity cannot be entirely evicted from the discussion. First, there is a political system, that does work at the national level, and it does create, you also have a certain space for Muslim representation, non-elected representation, through minorities commission, but also through government organizations that take care of minority affairs. So I'm thinking of the Hajj Committee, for instance, or the Waqf Council. So all these are government organizations that manage minority affairs, and for which you need people from among Muslims to be appointed. And so I think it does raise the question of who sits there and who acts for Muslim minority, for Muslims as a whole. And then I think another reason why I think we cannot entirely avoid the question of unity is because political parties themselves use a rhetoric of Muslim unity. MIM does so. But even if you look at the Muslim League is not called the Kerala Muslim League. I mean, it's called the Indian Union Muslim League. It claims to represent, and it has political ambitions at the national level. It does have branches in North India, although, of course, the only place where it is very strong and electorally strong is in Kerala. So I think we need to understand why we have such a complexity and what kind of imbalances, in what way are Muslims inadequately represented according to their internal divisions. I think it is a very valid question that was raised, of course, by the Pasmanda groups who challenged the leadership of the dominant caste, the Ashraf, but it's also occasionally raised by other sectarian groups. So, for instance, in 2005, some Barelvi leaders moved away or created their own faction of the Muslim Personal Law Board, which they called the Muslim Personal Law Board Jadid. It was Taqi Raza Khan, so the grandson of Ahmed Raza Barelvi from Barelvi in UP. So the Barelvi sect tried to establish its own personal law board, and it was not successful. It didn't work out. And also, we should mention, if we talk of internal diversity, there are lots of voices coming from women among the Muslims, and some of them seeking to represent and to act in the name of women. Not all of them, of course. So I think the question of how to understand this complexity and whether it is reflected in the national institutions, that is my way of approaching this question. And here we see that Kashmiri Muslims, Assamese, and to a certain extent, Bengali Muslims are not, for instance, very much present in all these central institutions and Muslim organizations, in spite of the fact that they have large Muslim populations and a lot of locally based, Muslim organizations, but they don't reach the top levels of these organizations.
Well, thank you. And are there any more questions? If Julien wants to, if we can stay back, we can also stop, wind up the formal discussion, then we can have a conversation. If some people want to have, to continue this conversation, we can continue maybe, we'll close it formally maybe, and then we can continue if people like that way.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
But if there is any question, we can take. Otherwise, we will. So, Kailash, do you want to ask any question? I see Kailash there. But okay. So, thank you very much, Julien, for such a wonderful talk. It's not very usual that we come across very good presentations and discussions on certain topics. So I hope you also found the conversation somewhat useful to your research activity.
Yes, I really enjoyed it.
We have benefited more, of course, from your presentation
I don't think
than what we might have been benefited by our questions. So before I ask Dr. Bizu, my colleague, to formally present a vote of thanks or to thank you on behalf of the department, I just want to make one more observation, kind of a loud thinking. That you have brought out contradictions in the limitations of Muslim politics and the complexities, etc. So when Professor Swan, the head of the department, asked me to chair this meeting, I told him that, look, I'm not the right person to chair this meeting. Why are you asking me? Professor Manjari is there, or Professor Arun Patnaik, who have done some work but he said, no, this is related to what you're working, to your interest is on leadership. So let me finally go back to the leadership question. And to briefly comment on that, if at all that is useful to you, to your work. Looking at this Naya Neta thing, a lot of research last 30 years. I remember Pauline Kolenda started speaking of political entrepreneurs in the 1970s and how the word entrepreneur, what does it actually mean when you say political entrepreneur? Still, we have recent book by Andrew White, who wrote a book on political entrepreneurs in Tamil Nadu. So from 1970s to 2020s, we have people speaking of a new class of politicians emerging at local level. And in between, we have people like James Manner writing on the fixers in Karnataka. And our colleague, actually, one of our colleagues was Hargopal, wrote an article called "The Pyravi Car, the Middleman in Politics," which is considered to be which is very well quoted. He and Professor Ram Reddy, who was professor at Osmania University and later became UGC chairman, they together wrote that article, which appeared, I think, in Asian Survey long ago. It's called "The Pyravi Car." So whether it's James Manner's Pyravi fixer or our own colleague from Saragopal's Pyravi car, and there are other people who wrote on intermediaries, on brokers, etc. In all this, what I found, in fact, I think your talk helped me a little bit getting some clarity on that. They have been arguing that these political aspirants, they are apolitical in the sense that they can go to any party. For them, the partisanship is not stable. It's not the ideology that matters. It is they want to get things done for their clients, and they themselves are clients to somebody else. It's not that they are also clients. So they will go to any party where they can get things done. They have their own interests, and they serve their own interests by serving the interests of the people in the locality. So it is in the sense, it is a very secular activity. It is no more a kind of a partisan ideological activity, but a very secular activity. And the border is very fragile political attachments. So the partisanships become very fragile, and the politics are always fluid, and these people can keep moving, migrating from one party to the other party. I mean, that was a theory that they have developed. And now we are saying that, look, they can be actually combined. The identity politics and the Nayaneta politics, they can actually go together. So there is no, they are not two mutually exclusive compartments, or they are not opposed to each other. And the kind of opposition that was posited by some of these writers on the entrepreneurs or the Naya Netas, fixers, and political aspirants, probably I think that is the new thought that came to my mind. But anyway, we can talk about it later. Now, I request Dr. Bizu, our colleague, to close the meeting and make a few observations of his own. I know Dr. Bizu will not make just a formal vote of thanks, but he will make his own observations on the topic. Bizu?
Yeah. Dear Julien Levesque and colleagues, friends and students, this is very interesting to listen to the changing dynamics of Muslim politics in India from a research scholar and a contributor to various distinguished journals, and also author of book on this topic. And anyway, looking at history, anyway, we have understood only about many constraints, weakness, rather than strength of Muslim politics. But anyway, many of the observers following Julien Levesque's line may argue that this particular event, Shaheen Bagh, has contributed much to strengthen it. But anyway, I think when this kind of a tempo of the movement was not fulfilled because of COVID pandemic and other things, because the adversaries of Muslims also were stopping their project of going ahead of there. And anyway, this has produced some kind of an imagination level. That's what many people are saying about imagination level, new imagination started, etc. But the real effects are yet to be seen. That's what my observation anyway. That is why this is too tentative to say this as a landmark or what, because it was not continuing in that sense because of other external reasons. And second is that, as Manjari was saying, it is very interesting to see the local effect. That was also what the observation I wanted to make after your presentation. But anyway, since this Thanksgiving was coming to me, I didn't participate in the discussion. And anyway, it was very interesting. And also I think that this helps us, your research findings and studies actually help us, and your own analysis also help us to explore and explain things about Muslim politics and its changing dynamics today and also in future. Thank you a lot on behalf of the department for presenting your research findings, and also the audience. Anyway, they also make this event a very fruitful one. And thank you everyone for participating in this. And thanks once again for Prof. Suri to chair this session, and also Anagha and Sneha for coordinating and inviting the scholar. And thank you all. Thank you everyone.
Thank you very much. I was really happy to participate and to have this discussion, and I'm really grateful to the audience for attending as well.